So now we'll get going. So what we're going to do today is go through this high-risk role of an intermediary. It is a 1-hour CE contracts course. If you want the credit, please put your name and license number in the chat and send the Venmo, and we'll get you, and if you're here, you'll get credit with Briggs Freeman, whether or not you pay or put your license number in, because we know, our new policy at Briggs Freeman, if you want to do intermediary without appointment, is that you have to have been licensed for 5 years and have done at least 20 deals and have taken this class. Basically because it's just a risk mitigation approach for us. Russ, this class is the brainchild of Russ because he feels very, very strongly about this. And I will tell you, I was just reading an article in Inman from yesterday about how like the NAR settlement that we had, that's not the last lawsuit that's going to happen in our industry now that the attorneys have realized like, hey, there's dollars here and there's also maybe not a lot of best practices that are being followed. And there's also agents that are trying to do workarounds around the lawsuit. I think that they have like plenty of fodder to work with. There's a lot of antitrust questions with respect to like promoting like off markets and things like that. Like, is that really fair to the consumer? Do they understand? So there's lots of risk involved in what we do. And the point of this class is not to scare you. It's just to make you aware and to educate you. So I just wanted to put all of that out there. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Okay. This class will be a million times better, as they all are, if you guys like speak up, ask questions, give examples. At the end, we are going to talk about what ifs. So if you have some of those, we might like put them in the parking lot and revisit them. But I just want to walk through this. It honestly might not even take us an hour because this is not like rocket science and there's not that much information to cover, but it's very important information. And it's important that you guys are doing it properly. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the history of intermediary in Texas, talk about the 2 different types of intermediary and what the duties and obligations are depending on how you're acting. Talk about all the different proper documentation for it. And then what are, best practices when you're doing it. And then of course we can kind of talk through some what ifs. And we will be talking about non-represented buyers because that is a big area of liability as well. And it kind of goes hand in hand with intermediary. So I know all the managers are on this call too. So if you guys have something to add, please feel free to unmute and throw it out there. And we will just get going. One reminder, at the end of class, I will send out a link that has a survey for feedback, which Trek requires us to do. There's also a pretty good article with FAQs from the Texas Association of Realtors a couple of years ago. So I'm going to attach that, and anything else that we talk about that I say I'll share. Sometimes that comes up. So, okay, we have a good group of 70 of you guys. So pressure's on for me. Okay, so history of intermediary. This isn't super relevant, but you guys sometimes, if you've been around for a long time, you might have heard of or remember dual agency. And what dual agency is when you are a dual agent and you represent both sides. In 1996, it was codified. Intermediary was added to the Texas Real Estate License Act so that dual agency is no longer allowed or exists here because it's impossible to fully represent 2 sides of a story, right? I mean, you can't, in Texas, if a lawyer said, I'm going to represent both sides, it's just not allowed. Like, that's crazy. You can't do it. You're always going to have biases. You're always going to give one information that the other doesn't have, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just not allowed. So they created this concept of intermediary status, which was codified into our Real Estate Licensing Act. And it lays out all these rules that we're going to talk to. So if you ever hear dual agency, that's a big no. We don't do it here. We have intermediary, and it's very specific how we do it. In theory, dual agency was good because you could like streamline everything, but you just can't do that with competing interests. You have confidentiality concerns, you have fairness concerns, so it's just gone. So any questions about that? No dual agency, yes, intermediary. And it's part of our licensing act now. Good? That's the quick and dirty history. Intermediary is allowed here, dual agency is not allowed here. Okay. So there's 2 types of intermediary, and you guys know this. There's intermediary with appointment, and then there's intermediary without appointment. And intermediary with appointment is when the broker appoints in writing 2 separate agents to write the buyer and represent the buyer and the seller. So if, you know, Robert has a listing and Holly's gonna bring him the buyer, that's intermediary, because Briggs Freeman is the same broker, and even though they're in different offices, it's still intermediary, because our shared broker is the same. But Robert will be appointed to represent the seller, and Holly will be appointed to represent the buyer. And in that case, they both still can fully represent their clients, give advice, give opinions, pull CMAs, negotiate, share information appropriately, everything that they could do, like it's full representation when you have intermediary with appointment. So the stickiest situation is intermediary without appointment. And that's what you need. That's what you need to qualify for at Briggs Freeman in order to be able to do it. We just don't want new agents doing it or people that don't have a lot of experience under their belt, because it's really hard. But we also know there's agents that have been in the business forever that do this a lot, and we just want to remind you guys about what the rules are. Because I think doing this properly is also really, really hard. Because basically, these are the rules. No one is appointed, you're not appointed separately, right? It's one agent that's going to work with both sides. You can't advise them on price, you can't advise them on terms, you can't negotiate on behalf of one or the other. You can't disclose confidential information. You can't provide guidance on offers or counteroffers. At that point, you basically become a paper pusher. And I think it's probably really, really hard to do without bias and properly. So you just have to really mind your P's and Q's if you're going to do both sides. And really what we say doing both sides, but really you should be doing no sides, because all you're doing is paperwork. Right? You can't really advise them. You can't give them counsel. You can't negotiate things. You can't do anything that would give one an advantage over the other, right? If your buyer asks you to pull comps, can you do that? Like, not really. I mean, maybe you could pull all the comps in a market and send it to both sides and say here, because then they all have the same information. But you would need to be careful, because if you miss a comp that's helpful to one side or the other, that looks like bias, right? So you just have to be really, really careful if you choose to do this. I understand there are circumstances in which it's going to happen. It should not happen like super frequently, and it's better to find another agent that you can refer one of the sides to and do intermediary with appointment. One of the things that's tricky about this is that if I have a listing and I've listed this house and it's been on the market for 43 days, and then I pick up a new buyer and I think it could be the perfect house for them. The challenge is that right now I represent the seller. I'm supposed to represent the buyer. And if the buyer's like, I want you to represent me, or I want you to stay and help both of us, you can't really help your sellers. You've been working with them throughout all of the pre-listing and the listing, and now all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm out. I just facilitate paper now. It's really hard to switch that hat and put it on. So this is why we just wanted to point that out. Does anyone have questions about this? When you do it, do you find that it's difficult to do, or does anyone have a spiel that they give their clients if they're going to do this? That's like, here's the deal. If you want me to do it this way, like I can't help you anymore. I mean, that's kind of what you need to say.
I can give my 2 cents.
Yes, please.
So I had one opportunity 2 years ago, kind of in the height of the market. I had a buyer from California come to one of my listings, and he wanted me to show it to him. And the house had not been shown much. And so I went ahead and showed it to him, and I showed some other, properties in the area. So he decided to make an offer. And he said, I want to use you. He said we had been looking in Bernie, Texas, and our agent there, he said, we're not going to use her. And so he said, I want you to make the offer. And I was like, considering it. And I was like, I don't ever do this. I don't think this is a good idea. But again, I went ahead and asked my sellers, because I think anyone who is even considering it needs to ask their sellers first. I think that needs to be the first. If you have the listing, I think the seller should have that opportunity to say yay or nay or whatever. So I went ahead and let my sellers decide what they wanted to do, and they said, no, we don't want to do that. So I
Right,
was really glad I did
advice.
that.
Mm-hmm.
But then the way the transaction went, I am so glad I didn't do it because it turned into the biggest shit show. These California buyers bought a dually truck in the middle of their underwriting, which changed their ratios.
Fun.
And then they lied about it and they said, well, we're gonna have to delay closing and because they're gonna be in Hawaii. And I mean, literally it just I could go on and on. I don't want to take up time. But it was if I had even attempted to do intermediary without appointments, it just I would have been in a lawsuit.
Yeah,
So
yeah. The other
it,
challenge is that, that's good. That's a good story. Thank you. I think the other challenge is, what if Jackie had been like, you know what, like, I'm gonna do it, like the sellers are fine with it, the buyers are fine with it. The challenge is what happens if Susan shows up the next day and is like, I have a buyer that also wants to write an offer, like while you're negotiating. Now you're in a super awkward spot, right? Because you can kind of not give the seller advice anymore because you're facilitating it for the buyer, but also they are gonna want your advice because there's another offer in play. It just gets really, really hairy. So tread lightly is the moral of the story here. You guys will probably get sick of hearing me say that, but I think you just have to contemplate that situation and what it looks like and what's, the ethical right thing to do. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about how do we document this properly. And I think to Jackie's point, like she said, it's her listing. She showed it to the buyer, which we're allowed to do. We should do that. Obviously, when you show your listing to a buyer, like you're still representing the seller. And so at the point when they start talking about an offer, you just need to remind them, like, remember, I represent the seller. If you're looking for advice or representation, like, I can refer you to an agent that could help you. But I want to point out, these are the kind of all of the relevant pieces of paper that connect to intermediary, and we're just going to walk through them all. And again, if you have questions, speak up. So the first one is the IABS. And sorry, my underlining is weird. So the first thing you're going to do is get the IABS signed. And then you're going to have the client consent in writing to the intermediary situation. And that's built into the buyer's rep and it's built into the listing agreement, right? And we're going to look at that. And then once you actually get to like the offer writing stage, then you also add this intermediary relationship notice. So in theory, if we're doing this properly, like the client should be well versed on like, who is this person that I'm talking to? Who do they represent? Do they have my best interest in mind? It should not be a surprise that, oh, I thought you were helping me all along, right? Like as the buyer, like if you're presenting the IABS in the right way, and then also once you get the representation agreement signed, it should be obviously pretty clear. So let's just look at these, but those are the 3 steps: IABS, written consent through their representation agreements, and then the intermediary relationship notice when you get to the offer writing stage. So one thing, let's look first here at the IABS. So, when we present this document, we're usually just like checking a box, right? But when we actually go and read what it does, is that explains to the customer, like, who is this person, license holder that I'm talking to? Like, who can they represent? They can represent the seller or the landlord. They can represent the buyer or the tenant. And then it explains intermediary. And I know that length of writing is too small for me to write, so I blew it up here on the side. It says to act as an intermediary, they must first obtain the written agreement of each party, which is what we get in our representation agreements. And then it will state, who pays the broker and how that works. And now this lays out like, what are your duties as an intermediary? And this is intermediary with appointment or without appointment. This is your duty. Everyone always must be treated impartially and fairly, right? You may, with the party's written consent, appoint a different license holder. So that are explaining like license, but they're explaining it that it can be with appointment, right? But you cannot ever disclose that the owner will accept a price less than the written asking, that the buyer tenant will pay a greater price, or any other confidential information unless the client like specifically allows you to do so. So these are just the basic fundamentals that we always must follow. And it's here in this document. So this is the first point that the person you're dealing with should be like exposed to what representation looks like, and they should read it. Like, I encourage you guys to like tell your people to read this, and if they have questions, that's great. So that's IABS, that's what that looks like. Any questions there? No, okay, cool. So then this is the listing agreement. Obviously, this is not the whole listing agreement. I just pulled out the relevant page that talks about intermediary. And I think probably 100% of the time when we take a listing, we're checking this box 9A, which says to the seller, you know, they are consenting in writing to intermediary here in the listing agreement, right? And the broker may show the property to interested buyers that broker also represents. And seller is authorizing them to act as an intermediary. And then it kind of walks through, if a prospective buyer is serviced by an associate other than the listing agreement, then broker will notify them by appointing, you know, the separate appointments. If this prospective buyer is serviced by the same associate, then broker will notify the seller that they'll either appoint another associate to carry it out with the respective buyers, or appoint someone to you know, work with the seller, or the broker can notify the seller that there's going to be no appointments. And in that case, they will act solely as the intermediary, and they can facilitate the transaction, but will not render opinions or advice during negotiations. So it's again, just spelling out to the parties, this is what these three options look like. Either broker is going to appoint someone to represent the buyer, the broker will appoint someone to represent the seller, or the broker will not do appointments. Or you check this box, which is like, no, I don't want Briggs Freeman buyers to look at my listing, which would be super weird. Right? So we always pretty much check this box. And then you'll notice that language from the IABS about what we are not allowed to do when we're intermediary is like reiterated here in bold. So it's very important. They're not messing around. Questions? Does anyone have questions about that when you sit down with the seller and go through the listing? Does anyone ever have like an issue, or that's pretty straightforward?
Yeah, a quick question.
Yeah,
So if you're representing the seller and you said, like on the first page, that if there's something specific, they say, okay, you can share this with the buyer. Is there a different form for that to get that in writing so that the seller can't come back and say, hey, I didn't say you could tell them that?
yeah, so, you know, in general, our new listing form, and I don't have the whole form here, but it does allow you, if commission is like negotiable, there's that box you can check that says like, yes, you're allowed to say that the seller is open to paying other closing costs. So there's that piece that's just a general approval. There is a separate form, and one of the managers will have to remind me what the number is, but there is a seller's authorization to release certain information, or it's called something like that. Maybe someone can find it and put it in the chat. And that's if they were like, yes, I want you to authorize that, like, I'm going through a divorce and I need to sell by December. You're okay to tell people that, or it's okay for you to tell people that we're moving and we need to sell, or something like that. Use that if you want to just be explicitly clear that there is information that you intend to disclose and the seller is okay with it. Good question.
Can't you just have that in an email that is confirmed by both sides?
I mean, I think that that's fine. It's not, it really would just need to be confirmed from the seller, right? Because they're authorizing you. It just
Right.
depends. Like we know clients who are like nitpicky or feel litigious or whatever. And if you want to really mind your P's and Q's, there is a form for that. But yes, having something in writing, if you're going to do like a bonus, offer like a cash bonus or a closing cost credit, I think something that's like very specific like that, you should fill out the form for. So hope that helps. Does that answer your question, Susan? Okay, cool. Okay, so on to the buyer's rep. Again, this is where we're getting, you know, written consent to show Briggs Freeman listings to our buyers. It straddles pages 3 and 4. But yes, most buyers are going to want to see Briggs Freeman's listings, right? And it kind of spells out the same thing. And then it's our same disclosure from the IABS of what we are and are not allowed to do. One thing just to point out that's in our listing agreement that's special is here, this competing clients, you know, client acknowledges that broker may represent other prospective buyers or tenants seeking to acquire the same properties that are interesting to the client. Client agrees that the broker may, during the term and after it ends, represent other prospects, show other prospects the same properties, et cetera, et cetera. not too long ago, we had a buyer that wanted to cross that out and we were like, no, that's impossible. It would shut us down, right? If we couldn't only show certain listings to one buyer. So just pointing that out. But any questions here? This is just so you guys can see that this is the written authorization that you're getting from the buyer to like serve as intermediary. Pretty straightforward. Good? Okay. So now, once they've seen the IABS, they've acknowledged at the beginning of the relationship when you sign your representation forms that they do want to see Briggs Freeman properties or have Briggs Freeman buyers pass through. Now, when you actually get to the place where you're writing an offer, you are going to use this intermediary relationship notice, and it should be sent with the original offer. To just say, to be clear upfront, there's no confusion, like this is who I represent, this is who I don't represent. And if you're doing it without appointment, absolutely, it should be done upfront with the offer so that you have had the conversation with both clients, like this is where our, closeness ends and where I become like a paper pusher for you, basically. So this is what the form looks like, and I filled it out. So you can see if it's intermediary with appointments, you have the seller's name, the buyer's name, Briggs Freeman's the broker, what's the property address, and then the date should be like the date that the offer is written, right? So that it's upfront from the beginning, like this is how we're gonna do this. And then if it is going to be with appointments, you say broker will appoint licensed associates, and Jason's gonna represent the seller and Jennifer's gonna represent the buyer. And then at this point, they're not the buyer yet, they're just the prospect, right? Because it's not under contract. But this is part of our contract. It is crucial that it gets signed upfront, guys. Not like as the last piece so that you can get your commission paid, right? So that's what that looks like. If you have a listing and for whatever reason you have decided that you do want to just step away from representation of both the seller and the buyer and just become a facilitator, then this is where you say broker will not appoint. And it's just reminding the client, reminding the seller and the buyer, what they've already signed, that they agreed to this, and what this means. It's just a reminder. So that's how that looks like if you fill it out without appointment. Any questions here? I know it's super fun.
Sorry, Serene,
Yeah.
on that last one,
Uh-huh.
if you're representing both, let's just say I'm the listing agent and then the buyer, I'm gonna represent the buyer.
Mhm.
That's with, will not appoint. Where does it show on that form that it's Jackie, that it's me?
It doesn't.
Okay,
Doesn't.
I didn't know if you put it the same name in both the owner and the prospect or
Nope.
not at all.
Nope. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I mean, obviously it's you because you're the one that's like sending in them all of this stuff to sign. And they've already kind of had this explained to them in their representation agreements.
But
It's a
then
good
what about the page on the contract for the buyer seller?
This page.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
How
I
do you
see
do that?
Yeah. Thank you. So if in the contract, on the last page is the broker information, and this still happens from like very, very seasoned agents when we have Briggs Freeman agents on both sides. It says listing broker and other broker. If we're doing intermediary, there's no other broker. It's just Briggs Freeman. So this is what our deal would look like. Listing broker, listing associate, all of his contact, and then the buyer's associate and all of her contact. And that's what that looks like on this side. So if it's intermediary, you're just putting it all on this side, okay? And technically you don't need to put a number here because in our listing agreement, the commission is covered. There's not another broker that's being paid. So you would not need to put like 3% here.
No, but my question is, do you put your name twice if you're doing both sides?
No, because
So your name's nowhere on the contract?
I mean, I guess you are gonna be the listing associate. I guess you could put it twice. I mean, it's gonna be in your reach out. They're gonna know. Yeah, I guess you could put your name twice. I don't know if Angela or if any of the managers have an opinion there.
Well, you just check the box seller and buyer as an intermediary
Yes.
at the top. So you just
Right.
put your name once.
Yeah, makes more sense. You can put it both if you want to, but it's just duplicative. Because if we're saying we're in an intermediary and there's only one name here, then it's implied that you're doing both. And that's gonna be entered into ReChat as well. So that's what that looks like. It should all go on this side. So does anyone have questions right now?
Zareen, I had this happen like many, many years ago, and it was another agent within the brokerage representing her son, and there was a lot of confusion about if she was taking a commission or not. Don't you think wouldn't it be a best practice to maybe list a fee just so there's no maybe kind of confusion there, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a best practice to confirm in writing, like, hey, Adrienne, I know this is my listing and you, my listing is for 6% for 3 and 3. And yours is also for, and you could email me and say, hey, do you have a buyer's rep comp built in? How much is it? And I would email you back and say, yes, it's 3%. I think having a writing between Briggs Freeman agents is a good idea. It doesn't make sense to put it in this blank because this blank says listing broker has agreed to pay other broker a fee. So that doesn't make sense. But I think having a writing to document like, yes, she called me and she knows, buyer agent comp is X, it's good to document it.
Okay.
Good question.
I'm going to chime in. It's also going to be important to pay attention whether your listing agreement has the broker paying the full compensation or if you agreed that the seller would pay the other broker directly.
Yeah, so I didn't include that, the addendum regarding broker's fees, but if it's a Briggs Freeman listing and there's, no, the what's agreed to in the listing fully covers what the buyer's broker compensation is, you don't need any additional compensation paperwork. So it's a good point. But yes, being clear is always a good idea. If it's a situation where if I had a 5% listing, 3% for myself and 2% for Amber, and Amber brings me an offer and her representation agreement is for 3% as the buyer's agent, we would need that addendum regarding broker's fees because we would say already the seller's paying the 5%, which we've agreed to meet, and she's gonna have to ask for her additional 1% in, oh gosh, I'm rusty, D2B. Okay, so that's the only time you're gonna need additional documentation for compensation is when the listing agreement in an intermediary situation does not cover the buyer's compensation. Okay, so we're moving right along. We're blowing through this, but we're gonna talk through some scenarios now. So what happens if the buyer doesn't want to have representation, right? And this is a sticky situation and you need to kind of ask first. I think the first question is like, okay, if they're like, I'm here, I don't want representation. I think the first question to have is like, okay, why is that? Like, do you think you're saving money? Like, are you saving commission? Were you badly burned by, like, have the discussion why, and we're gonna walk through what the listing agreement actually provides in terms of how you would be compensated. Because right now, if a buyer goes unrepresented, technically the listing agreement provides that the listing agent is still gonna make the full commission. So the buyer is not saving themselves any money by going unrepresented. And I think they need to understand that. Obviously, they can negotiate and say, well, I want to go unrepresented, but I want a 2% discount on the commission. You're gonna have to like talk that through with your seller, but it just gets messy. So you have to be able to kind of just have the discussion. We're gonna look at the paperwork. So if a buyer doesn't want to have representation, talk to them about like, what is it? And explain to them the value of a buyer's rep and maybe send them some of our collateral. So at least that they understand what they will get. And also explain that as the listing agent, you'll be interacting with them, but you always represent the seller. So any information that you learn will always be shared with the seller, right? And I think we think that's fine, obvious, duh. But I think when you get into a situation and you have a buyer that's like, oh, I want to save some money, so I don't want representation, so I'm going to sign this form but then you show up and you're at every showing because you have to let them in and you're there when their plumber comes and you're there like, and they're asking you questions, like, I think it just can get blurry and you think about that buyer like 3 years later, like on the witness stand being like, well, she was there all the time and she answered my questions. Like, it's just risky. So you have to, our first step, if someone insists that they don't want representation, is this is our 2-page, notice regarding non-representation and acknowledgement of non-representation. And it basically, the first notice is like from you as the listing agent to the buyer saying, we think everyone should have representation and we're giving you notice to be clear that we represent only the seller. We can't offer you any advice, anything you tell us we're going to share. We can't give you any information, even if we're going to be present, right? We have a fiduciary duty to the seller. So we're just saying up front, like all of these things. So you have to sign it. They have to initial it, the buyer that doesn't want representation. And then the second page of this document, and these are in rechat and zip forms for you guys, is that the buyer is kind of acknowledging that they received this document and they're basically releasing us from all liability, right? And us and everyone connected to Briggs Freeman, like they've chosen to go on their own and they're really on their own. And that's what this looks like. So it's a 2-page document that unrepresented buyers must sign. And it may be the situation where you present this to them and they actually read it and they're like, okay, maybe I do want representation, in which case then you call up your teammate, partner, friend, whoever you think would be a good fit for them and say, I have a buyer that's ready to write an offer on my listing and they do want representation and I'm not going to do intermediary without an appointment. Can I give you this referral? And then you can work out compensation wise when you hand someone a hot buyer who's ready to write an offer, what does fair compensation or look like and what does referral look like? So it doesn't have to be a referral because you're going to get your full amount from the listing agreement and then you guys can divide it as accordingly. But to Adrienne's point, you should document in writing. If I have a buyer and they say, okay, yeah, please do refer someone and I refer them to, Jason, and Jason's like, yeah, I'll do it for 2 and you keep 4, whatever. I'll do it for 3 and you do it for 3 and I'll pay you a 25% referral fee or whatever you guys think is fair, right? We know some clients are more difficult than others. So that's what this form looks like. If you have a buyer who doesn't want non-representation, it is definitely required at Briggs Freeman. And just to remind you guys, listing broker compensation with no buyer representation. So this is what this is the compensation section from our listing agreement. This is what it says. So we fill it out and we say, let's just say 6%, right? We charge 3%. As the listing agent and our seller agrees that 3% is a good amount to offer to a buyer's broker upfront. This says if the broker does not pay the other broker that procures a buyer as specified here, then broker's fee will be reduced by an amount not paid to the other broker. So of course, now this only deals with other brokers, but if I have a listing and it's 6% and I get an offer from someone at Ebby, and they are only asking for 2% because that's what their buyer's agent, that's what their buyer's rep agreement says. Then in this case, they're going to get paid 2, I'm going to get paid 3, and that extra 1% is going back to the seller. So the fee is automatically reduced. Now, that was a change in the August forms. They just clarified that that's how that works. So if it's not like a bonus for us if the other agent doesn't negotiate for themselves for 3%. Is that clear? Yes, okay, I just want to point that out. And now this is another really important part, especially when we're talking about unrepresented buyers. This says, broker will retain all amounts specified in 5A1, so 6%, if there is no other broker that procures the buyer, including intermediary situations, or if the buyer is unrepresented. So that's why we don't need additional paperwork if it's intermediary, right? Because this right here says, if it's intermediary, you're paying us this much. It also says, if it's an unrepresented buyer, you're paying us this much, because we know we're going to have more work. And honestly, it's more exposure and liability for us. So we don't feel bad about taking a full fee.
Serena, I have a question.
Yeah.
Has anybody really come across a broker representing the buyer that didn't negotiate their fee up to that 3% if they'd already had a 2% agreement with their buyer's broker. If we're offering 3%, why would anybody leave that on the table unless they, I mean, why would they do that?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think buyers aren't dumb. They're like, if I'm offering $1 million and my agent is getting paid 2%. If my agent is like, just kidding, they're offering 3, so let's ask 3, like a buyer's gonna know, like, I'm paying that additional amount, right? Like they could get a percentage off, if that makes sense. I think buyers could probably figure that out, maybe not. But because what you have to do then is that if you have a 2% listing agreement, I mean, buyer's rep agreement, and they're offering 3, you have to go back to your buyer and amend your representation agreement up to 3%, which I think is probably gonna be really hard to do. Cause the buyer would probably be like, why can't I keep that 1%? Or why can't you rebate that back to me? Or, I think it would be hard to do. That's why
Has anybody,
advise-
has
anyone
anybody
had
come
that?
across a situation where their seller is getting that 1% back?
I guess her question is, has anyone had a situation where you had 6% in your listing agreement and the buyer's rep only asked for 2, so the seller benefited and got that percentage back? Has anyone seen that in a deal?
We're typically not
No.
privy to that somebody's buyer rep agreement.
No,
Right.
but you'll know at closing if your seller gets that back, right?
So we recently had a situation where we put in an offer and I asked the seller's agent, so I was on the buy side, what the compensation was, and they said 2%. So we got into a multiple offer deal, and originally I'd submitted our first offer at 3%, and she didn't bat an eye, but then she said, hey, we're taking final and best, and whatever's best, the best economics for the seller. Long story short, I ended up putting it at 2%, but when we went to the closing table, the agent was getting 4% and I was only getting 2%.
Oh, wow.
So she was getting 6%, but only was trying to negotiate against me.
She then economically goes for herself.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, that's crazy. We've had that happen. Actually, Lauren von Rosenberg had that happen with a Redfin agent also, who negotiated her commission down, and then that
That was a league real estate agent.
That's gross.
I'm
that's a
okay.
question.
I was gonna say that we just had a deal that the seller was offering 2%, but we had a buyer's rep signed at 3%, and we just did an amendment to the buyer's registration agreement.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to amend down than to amend up.
Oh, right.
We encourage you guys to say, let's put 3% in here because we're seeing that in the marketplace and most sellers are offering that. If we get into this situation where it's less, we can amend this down, and I'm not gonna stand in the way of you getting the home of your dreams, right? That's the kind of conversation that needs to happen there. I do want to go back, and Macy, you did it exactly right. Like, put it at 3 and then amend down if you need to. And Raleigh did the same thing, right? Unfortunately, he got screwed because that agent was super dishonest, which is yucky. So I do want to go back to the point where someone said, well, we're not privy to people's buyers reps, and that's correct, but we do know how much they're getting paid because they have, if they're asking either the listing broker to pay it in, oh gosh, I don't have the addendum regarding broker's fees in front of me. I don't have the numbers in that section, or if they're asking the seller to pay some of it, like we can see what their agreement is, right? In that document. Like, it's not like it's a secret what they're getting paid. Does that make sense? I don't think I said that very well, but obviously if they're gonna ask the seller or the broker to pay their commission, we have to know what their commission is, and that is communicated to us on that compensation agreement between brokers. And again, if we have a compensation agreement between a listing agreement that says it's 2% for the buyer's rep, and the buyer's rep says 3, we're gonna know if they have a 3% because they're gonna put 2% in the first section of the addendum regarding broker's fees, and then they're probably gonna ask for 1 additional percent in that to the 2. So. Does this make sense, guys? I know this stuff is really tricky. I will say. It's complicated when we talk about it, but at the same time, when you guys are out in the field and having these negotiations, like the managers and I have had so many calls about how the people that you are dealing with are like beyond clueless about how any of this works. And you guys are having to kind of do a lot of explaining and advocating, and sometimes you call us because the information that they're getting from their brokers is wildly incorrect. And that's really frustrating, but just keep fighting the good fight. It's gonna take a while for us to like flesh this out, but just keep doing what you're doing. Okay,
I have a
other questions about this? Yeah,
So I'm assuming like if you have an unrepresented buyer that insists on being unrepresented, they're gonna want a discount, I suppose. So where would you put on the listing agreement? Like, because I know that some people will be like, well, I'll keep 4% and they get the discount that way. Like, do you know? I don't know if I'm explaining that right.
no, you're explaining it. Obviously, the majority of the time when someone wants to go unrepresented, it's because they think that they're gonna save 3%. And I think one of the first parts of that conversation is, the compensation doesn't change just because you're unrepresented. And if they're like, well, I want it to, then, they don't have representation, but they're asking you to write that up, right?
Right.
So once again, you're already in a tricky spot. I think you have the discussion with your seller, or you tell them like, well, that's not how this works. I guess you want me to figure it out. I mean, you'd have to have the discussion with them of how you want to do it. But yes, you would have to. A little bit what they're doing is interfering with your contract with the seller, because your contract with the seller says you're going to make your full fee if there's no other broker involved. And they're saying, well, I want a reduction because there's no other.
And if that happens,
You don't really have to do that, first of all, right? Now, if the seller wants you to do that, and that's a separate conversation with the seller of like, all right, so this buyer is unrepresented. They think they know everything. They're probably going to be really challenging to deal with. The reason that they want to be unrepresented is because they want you to pay me less. And our agreement provides that you'll pay me the full amount if the buyer is unrepresented, because it's going to be more work for me. And also because it's more like liability for me. And then the seller has to decide like what's fair. And the seller's like, yes, I would like for you to reduce your fee so that we can get a deal done with this buyer. Then you have to do amendment to your listing agreement, and I would make it specific to that buyer.
Yeah.
This is Margot. At what point can the listing agent go back to the seller and say, well, we can renegotiate this and, the commission fee break? And then at what time does that buyer's agent have the right to know what it is?
So that's a conversation. I actually love this question. So you're not talking about non-represented buyers anymore. You're just talking about, correct?
Correct.
It's a good question. And I think there's actually a lot of confusion about this. Realistically, when you sign the listing agreement with your seller, that's when you have that conversation. You are saying, if the seller's like, well, let's put 3%, but also that's negotiable. It's like, that's an oxymoron, right? We have agreed to 3% and that is what we're offering. Now, if we get an offer that is too low with 3% built in there, then you can go back to the buyer and say, with the full commission and all the other closing costs that the seller is paying, this offer does not net the seller what they need to net. And then the buyer's agent has to understand, like, I can lower my commission, but you've offered the 3 upfront. If you have a seller that's like, I'm only going to pay 3 at this price, then you should not put 6 in your listing agreement.
Well, the listing agreement is something that if it's changed what you're going to pay, you have to amend it. I mean, that used to be something that was drilled into us 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you should not sign a listing agreement at 6% for 3 and 3 on both sides, And then when you get a bad offer, be like, just kidding, let's reduce the buy side commission to 2, and then this offer works. You can't do that once you've told another agent, or I guess you can if they haven't signed the compensation agreement between brokers, which you should not do, which is why we recommend that you guys sign it first. And I've heard the feedback that we're like the strictest on that. Of all the brokerages. And I mean, I kind of feel like a parent making their kid eat their broccoli right now, because it's the right way to do it. Like I can send you guys an article from Texas Association of Realtors about like, that's their intention, is that if you intend to write an offer on a property, you call the agent, they say, this is what the commission is, you sign that to document it, and then you write the offer. Like that is how it's supposed to work according to the people that built it. So I know
That's verbal.
but
Is there some, that's a verbal thing. It's like Raleigh said, can you go back?
But it's
and-
not a verbal thing. You can call them and ask them and they can say verbally, but there is a compensation agreement between brokers that you get signed in writing that says, this is what the seller has stated that they're offering on the buy side through the broker, and this is what the broker will pay. And that documents it. So it's not verbal.
And that's
and
part of the
that has to
offer.
be- That has to come in with the offer?
I would do the best practice, and what Texas Association of Realtors, who wrote the form, suggests that you do, is that you get it signed before you present your offer. So if you-
Okay.
So Margot, if you have a seller and they've said, yes, it's 6%, let's market it, let's put 3% on the buy side, and the buyer's agent does it the Texas Association of Realtors and Briggs Freeman recommended way, and they call you and they say, what's the buyer's agent commission? And you say, seller's offering 3%. And then they should send you that compensation agreement between brokers that you sign, and then they have it, and that's how the buyer's agent is protected, right? If they don't, lots of agents out there that aren't protecting themselves and getting that document signed, and it boggles my mind that brokers are coaching their agents to not have that signed. And it kind of boggles my mind that you guys wouldn't want to do it to protect yourself. I know it's painful and feels like we're making you do extra work, but it's the correct way to do it. It protects you, right? I feel like I sound like a mean old stickler, which is like who I am now.
Yeah, when
But
you
how it
say
goes.
you represent the buyer, and say I had a buyer that said, I only want to pay 2.5%.
Yeah.
And so that goes in there?
Well, yeah, so if I have a listing agreement that says 3% to buyer's agent, and you call me and you say, how much is it? And I say it's 3, and you're like, well, my buyer's rep only provides for 2.5. You can't write a compensation agreement between brokers for 3 because you're not authorized from your buyer to get 3. You would write it for 2.5. And then
Right.
my seller would get the extra 0.5%.
Okay.
Does that make sense? We just looked at that.
But as long as we have that 6%, I told it turned out it was 2.5 and 2.5, and it was all in house. It was an intermediary. So if they say we do 6, and my buyer says, when I get this from them, and my buyer says, well, we only do 2.5, I'll say, well, that's fine, but just know that that's going to the other agent. Is that how you do it?
In an intermediary, yes. Right? In an intermediary, that amount will go to the other agent because it says broker will retain the full amount in 5A1 if it's intermediary or non-represented buyer. If
Okay.
there's another broker involved, then the seller is going to get to keep that 0.5%. That's the difference between these two like pointed out paragraphs.
So can you amend, can we amend if the listing agent has it at 3%, can we amend the buyer's rep to read what the seller is offering and the buyer sign it?
Yeah, if you can convince your buyer to do that, absolutely you can do that. And you can even make it like property specific.
Right, okay.
I think a buyer might say, why don't you rebate that? You already agreed to 2.5%. Why are you all of a sudden worth more? Can you rebate that back to me? Or,
right.
So
Yeah, Zorine, you can also say to your buyer, well, look, I'm going to fight real hard for you to get that extra 0.5% off the sales price. So that's where we're going to try and do this.
Yeah.
Because they're offering me 3%. So let's just work real hard to get you a price that you're happy with.
Yeah. Perfect.
That's what I would say.
Love it.
Then you
Love it.
have to amend the listing agreement, right?
No, you're representing the buyer.
Right.
So you would say to your buyer, well, I have a 2.5% agreement with you, but the seller's willing to pay me 3%, so I get that extra 0.5%. Let's amend our agreement to say that the buyer broker, that the seller's going to pay me 3%, and I'll just work real hard to, make sure that 0.5% comes back to you somehow in the form of a lower sales price.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. I mean, you will.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, guys, the right way to think about this and talk about this with both your buyers and your sellers is that we're always talking about the seller net, right? So, getting a lower sales price and taking only 2.5% is the same thing as getting a slightly higher sales price and taking 3% in terms of the net to the seller, right? I hope I said that right. So at the end of the day, you just have to think about what is the net, what is the effect of what we're doing going to have on the net to the seller? Right? So that's why it's really, really important that you guys understand the distinction between this and this. Do we understand that, or do we want me to go through it one more time? You guys are probably sick of me. Go through it again or don't go through it again? I'm looking at you guys.
Go through again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So in our listing agreement, let's say we put 6%, right? 6% of the sales price and 3% to the buyer. We're gonna try to put our best foot forward to all those buyers out there. What this paragraph says is if there is another broker that procures the buyer, and we would pay them out according to this, but they don't have to pay that full amount, then this fee up here is reduced by the amount not paid to the other broker. So we're saying if this was 6 and this was 3, if the buyer's rep only says 2.5 and they don't like change it, and we really as Briggs Freeman only have to pay the buyer's broker 2.5, then we're only going to get 5.5, right? We're not getting that extra half. This is saying that extra half does go back to the seller. Okay. So that's the difference there. Now what down here, what this says is that if there's not another broker, what happens is the full amount goes to Briggs Freeman because it's either intermediary and we do have another with appointments and we have another agent who's going to get paid, or I'm doing both sides. And then sometimes that's a situation we're going to have to write language into special provisions. If you're in the unique situation where intermediary without appointments is appropriate and they want you to reduce your commission, we're just going to have to write language in there. So please reach out to me or Angela. But that should be rare. Or it says if it's an unrepresented buyer, you're still getting this full amount. So that's the distinction here, is that this is you're going to get the full amount if it's intermediary or unrepresented buyer. Briggs Freeman gets the full amount. If there's another broker who didn't ask for the amount that the seller agreed to, the seller gets that difference. Does that make sense? I feel like I keep explaining this, not good, which is not helpful.
What if there is another agent at Briggs Freeman that only asks for 2.5%?
Then the listing agent will get 3.5 and the Briggs Freeman agent would get 2.5. So it's not going to be, there's no additional documentation required to get Briggs Freeman paid. It's full 6%, and then the Briggs Freeman agents need to like work it out. Does that make sense? Which is, I do recommend you guys document when you're doing intermediary with someone else here of like who's getting what. Okay. All right, so Mitch has a question. What do you tell a seller who asks, why do I have to agree to buyer's compensation in the listing agreement if your brokerage isn't going to market a buyer's compensation amount? I think the answer is you don't have to agree to a buyer's compensation in the listing agreement. You don't have to agree to anything you don't want to do, right? Like that's what the whole lawsuit was about. The sellers can choose what they want to offer. I think the reason that you tell them what you say to them, the real answer to your question first is that you don't have to. You can offer nothing and we can negotiate that as it goes, 1Z, 2Z, right? And they can just ask you to pay their commission directly, and you can show them the addendum regarding broker's fees and how that would work. If we're gonna put 3% here, or if we're gonna put just 3% here and not offer anything to the buyer's broker upfront, which I don't think is like a crazy position. It's not the industry standard or the market standard right now. We are still seeing, for the most part, like 3% up here or close. But if you have a seller, like I said before, my husband would do this. He'd be like, we're not offering anything. And if they want it, they can bring us a great offer and ask for it. And that's how he is. And that's how some sellers are gonna be. And that's fine. So we would put 3% here for me and nothing upfront for the buyer's agent. And then depending on how good the offer is, we would agree, right? So that's the conversation, Mitch, you have to have. And it's not that we're gonna market it, but at the same time, like it is on our website. If anyone calls and asks us, we are gonna share. So you can say like, my job is to deal with buyers, brokers all day long on your behalf. So the agents that have buyers for your property are gonna know what you're offering. I'm gonna be talking to all of them, you know? So I think that's the answer. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, we have a few more what ifs. Oh, it's 2:27. Okay, we'll be quick. What if I have 2 clients to write an offer on the same property? This one's sticky. There's no like trek or tar like opinion on these things. You just have to do what's right. Like it's always our duty to treat everyone fairly and honestly. So you have to figure out what is fair. You have one client that's gonna be real mad if their other buyer wins it and they didn't, right? I know some of you guys have been in that position before where you're like, well, this client wants to write a $800,000 offer and this client wants to write a $850,000 offer on the same property. And you're like, the $800,000 feels like an exercise in futility because I know the other one's gonna beat it, right? But you're representing both. That's just a sticky situation. My recommendation would be to be honest and upfront with both parties and to say, I have another client who's interested in this property. I've actually been working with them looking for a home for almost a year. What I would like to do and what I think is in your best interest is for me on this particular property to write the offer for that other client. And I'm going to introduce you to Donna, who's a wonderful agent and who can represent you best and advise you best here. Are they going to feel like they got the boot a little bit? Yes. Are you in a much less ethically precarious situation? Also, yes. I mean, it's just I think I've had this conversation actually directly with several of you guys about what do I do here? I don't know if anyone has like a rabbit to pull out of their hat and share with everyone else, but that's a tricky one. I would recommend saying, I would like to, for the purpose of this one property, I feel very conflicted having 2 clients and doing it for both of you guys. I would like you to work with Barbara on this one property and hope that they would appreciate that. Okay, and then what if my buyers want to write an offer on my listing? It's a little bit tricky because you have confidential information about both sides. I'm always, as the attorney, gonna say, it's impossible. Obviously, we don't have dual agency. You can't represent both sides. So you have to explain to them, if you want me to do this, I have to take off my advisor hat and all I can do is facilitate paperwork for you guys, both of you, right? Seller and buyer. And I already have knowledge in my head of what both of you guys want. You're better off saying like, let me refer you, buyer, to my peer so-and-so for the purposes of this listing only. And I'm going to continue to represent the seller and you can have full representation, right? That's the best practice there. It's 2:30, so I'm not going to keep you guys longer. If you want CE credit, please make sure your name and license number in the chat. That's the only way that I'm gonna know. So when you call me in a month and you're like, I never got credit for that, I can go back into Zoom and log in and see whether you put your name in there. So, all right, now we're getting more names. This is a super fun, really not that helpful flow chart from the Texas Association of Realtors. I'm gonna send it to you guys when I send you the follow-up email, as well as that Texas Association of Realtors like FAQ that answers a lot of these questions. Hopefully this was helpful and not scary. This stuff is hard. I mean, you guys are representing people in the purchase and sale of like probably their single largest asset. Like what we do is hard and it's sophisticated, and hats off to you guys for being really, really, really good at what you do and taking the time to like educate yourself and want to be the best. That is going to pay off for you in the long run. And also for wanting to know how to do this like ethically and the right way. So preaching to the chorus, but thank you guys. I can stick around if anyone has questions. We're done. It's 2:31. I kept you a minute over. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And then my other question is, so if someone says, like I had on La Vista, he signed 3% for the buyer's agent, and then we said it depends on, then he changed it to it depends on net. Did I have to put that in writing? That's what I told everyone. It depends on net. Put it,
Repeat the question again. Sorry.
so if we sign 3%, okay, for the buyer's agent, I represent the seller. And then, you know, he was advised from another agent, pay per net or like based on net. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when the offers started coming in, or they'd ask, I'd say it's based on net. But you know, with a reasonable offer, we'll pay 3%. That's a good way to communicate it.
No, I mean, if you have I think this is what you have to say. If you have the seller that's like, I'm only gonna pay commission based on the offer, this is not a seller that's offering 3% upfront, okay? This is a 0% seller that is saying like, I will pay based on the offer. So I think there's a lot of confusion around that, and I probably should have clarified it. If you are in the situation where you have already offered 3% upfront, then what you need to say to the buyer is, we priced this house with 3% commission at the list price. And so if the offer does not meet the seller's expectations, it's not gonna net him what he needs because he's paying 3% commission and so many closing costs. So you, and then just let it sit there with the buyer's agent, and the buyer's agent should understand this offer is not netting the seller what they need. There's a few levers we need to push, right? We can increase the price. We can decrease my commission. We can pay for the title policy. You know, there's a few things that this buyer's agent could do then to accommodate getting the seller what they need to net. But just because the seller says I'm offering 3% doesn't mean that they have to agree to any deal that doesn't get them what they want. You can't, I don't think it's appropriate to go back to an agent and say, well, we would do this at 2% for you. Because I don't think agents love having their commissions negotiated, but I think the appropriate response is, this doesn't net us. This does not net the seller what they need to net. And he offered 3% at the list price, but based on all of the closing costs, this is not going to get him where he needs to go. So you need to offer more or reduce the closing costs in some way.
Okay, so if someone's just texting me, I can simply say, based on the list price, he's offering 3%.
Yep, that's a perfect answer.
And then if it gets more serious, then I explain the situation.
Yeah, and agents are afraid to use this. We're not offering anything up front, although I do think that the industry will probably move more and more that direction over time eventually. That's what other states and markets do it. They don't have like a co-op broker compensation in their listing agreements. It's just, I'm the listing agent, I get paid this. When we get offers, the buyers are going to ask us to pay a certain amount, and we will consider that based on what the offer looks like. So that's not where we are now. It may be the direction we head. I don't have a crystal ball. To me, like I said, my husband would do that. It seems like common sense, but right now, sellers are continuing to offer the co-broke commission. And so, but they have to understand if they offer it up front, they have to do it unless you just negotiate back and say, that's not netting them what they need to net. You need to increase the price or decrease the closing costs, i.e. your commission, title policy, whatever that is.
Okay, I really appreciate that. And last comment, I would never do intermediary because of the comment you said, even before, but the comment you said, it's like having two lawyers. I mean, one lawyer represents two different clients.
Yeah, you just, it's impossible to do it fair, even with like the best of intentions. And that's why they came up with this idea of intermediary. But to do intermediary and to be working on behalf of, but I don't like to say represent both sides, because I really don't think you're representing them anymore. You're just pushing paperwork on their behalf, you know?
I understand.
Great, awesome. Okay, thank
So
you.
Serene, I have
Appreciate
one
your
quick
thinking.
question.
Sure, what's up, Lily?
Oh, if the buyer has to negotiate down in, I mean, if you, although you have a buyer's rep for 3%, but the buyer says, in order for me to get this, I'm only going to be able to pay you 1%. But I'm just trying to figure out where the lender can come in. It doesn't cover any compensation that a buyer is paying in order to get a deal to go through, correct?
Yeah, it's just gonna have to be cash out of the buyer's pockets, and then you have to like look at reserves and things like that, just
Okay,
of a buyer that's squeezed. So if you are in this situation, like you do need to be in close contact with your buyer, where the seller's like, I'm not paying
Right.
buyers commission, like it's gotta come out of the, which is dumb, because at the end of the day, you're like, look, if you would accept my offer at $1 million with no buyer's commission, you should accept my offer at $1,030,000 with 3%, right?
That's-
Like,
right,
it's the same
right.
to you.
Right.
But if you just have a crazy seller like that, then you do need to work with the loan officer to say, the buyer's gonna need the cash amount of my commission at closing in addition to their down payment and what have you.
And they
So,
usually will do that now?
yeah, they
will
should help you, they should be able to help you figure it out. I
help
mean,
you
for
figure
most buyers is probably not a big deal. I think when you get into lower price points and buyers are more squeezed, or their like ratios are
Right.
tighter,
Right.
it could be a
Right.
problem.
Okay.
But that's why you just gotta be like super tight with the loan officer, right?
Great. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, bye.